Welcome back. Today it is time for us to talk about Module 9.2, which is on understanding intelligence. So last lecture, we talked a lot about the ways in which intelligence has been kind of measured over the years. Now we're going to talk about some different theories of how we might understand what intelligence is and how it functions. So the case of Blind Tom, who was born in the mid-1800s, essentially it was a pretty interesting story. He was born into a slave family. He was sold for nothing along with his mother. So his mother was sold for a profit, and basically he was a blind child, and he wasn't actually worth anything in the eyes of the traders, so he was actually basically kind of given away with his mother. And as an adult, he could speak very little. He knew fewer than 100 words, but he could play over 7,000 pieces on the piano. So he was basically what would now be known as a savant, an individual with a low mental capacity in most domains, but extraordinary abilities in other specific areas, such as music, mathematics, or art. So Blind Tom went on to play at the White House by the time he was 11 years old. He was on a world tour at the age of 16. His musical abilities were extraordinary, despite the fact that he could barely communicate verbally. So when we discuss someone's level of intelligence, we intuitively know what we are talking about. When we say, that person's smart, that person's intelligent, to us that means something. But what does it really mean to be intelligent? Throughout the history of intelligence testing, as we kind of talked about in the last lecture, there have been many different perspectives on what intelligence is, the most influential of which will be discussed in this module. So we're going to talk a bit more about some specific theories of intelligence and ways in which they view intelligence. So in the early 20th century, a researcher named Charles Spearman began developing techniques to calculate correlations among multiple measures of mental abilities. So basically looking at different abilities that one might have and how they're related to each other. One of these techniques that was used to kind of calculate those correlations was known as factor analysis. It's a statistical technique that examines correlations between variables to find clusters of related variables, or factors. And basically, a cluster or a factor would seem to measure some kind of common ability. So for example, language ability, mathematical ability, they would kind of all become clusters through factor analysis. Spearman found that children's grades in different school subjects were positively correlated, so students who did better in one subject were more likely to do better in other subjects, even when the content was very different. This led to his hypothesis of a general intelligence factor, which he kind of called G. And basically he would say that his G factor represented a person's mental energy. And this basically reflected his belief that some people's brains are simply more powerful than others. So if you had a higher G, that meant not only that you were kind of more intelligent, but that your brain was actually more powerful. This G factor has actually been supported by more than a century of research, and tests of G have been useful in predicting academic and occupational success. So whatever it is, whether or not we consider G to be intelligence per se, it definitely has been kind of helpful in terms of predicting what people might go on to great success. G correlates very well with high school and university grades, and it does seem to predict many seemingly unrelated phenomena, such as how long people will live, how quickly they can make judgments on perceptual tasks, and how well they can exert self-control. General mental ability, or G, has even emerged as the single best predictor of job performance, higher even than level of education or the performance during the job interview. So it is clear from all of these results that G does reflect something real. But the question that we want to ask is, does it tell us the whole story? We must remember, in this case and in every case, that correlation does not equal causation. So just because two things are related does not mean one causes the other. And we should ask whether G can explain everything that there is to be explained about a person's level of intelligence. So for example, when we just discussed Blind Tom and his incredible abilities, that can't possibly be explained by this general kind of mental ability factor, because based on the fact that he had such a small vocabulary and kind of low intellectual ability, he would not have scored very well on a measure of G at all. So here's a little bit of kind of the research results from some of the studies on general intelligence. So we do actually see that IQ scores They are fairly normally distributed, which we talked about a bit in the last lecture. And we do see that individuals who have higher IQ scores tend to be less likely to divorce within 5 years of getting married. They tend to be less likely to be living in poverty, and they tend to have been far less likely to have been incarcerated or put into jail or into a prison. So there are definitely a lot of positive outcomes associated with G, but that still doesn't really tell us whether or not that G factor, that general ability, is telling us the full story. So even Spearman himself believed that G didn't fully capture intelligence. The correlations in his research were never a perfect one, and if you remember what we talked about last semester, a perfect one would mean that, for every 1 point that IQ goes up, an individual would score, 1 point higher on something else. So it would have to be a perfect relationship between the two. And not only were they never one, they were usually far less. So even though they were related, it didn't necessarily mean that they were super strongly related. A possible explanation is that in addition to a generalized intelligence, people also possess specific skills. So Spearman basically added on to his own theory and said that we are going to call specific skill-based intelligence S. No one has really seriously questioned the S part of Spearman's theory. It's not really something that kind of comes under fire a lot, but the concept of G has at times been heavily criticized, leading to several different theories of what we call multiple intelligences. So even though Spearman, in adding in his S, kind of did allow for a bit more variability, that somebody might not necessarily have a super high G, but there are specific things that they might be skilled in, he was still heavily criticized in talking about that concept of having that one general ability that was much more important than anything else. So one of the first influential theories of multiple intelligences was Louis Thurstone's primary mental abilities. There were 7 clusters found when using factor analysis to examine intelligence scores, and included things like word fluency, numeric abilities, and memory. So all of these theories of multiple intelligences, they basically break intelligence down into different categories. So just because you don't necessarily score high in one doesn't mean you won't score a lot higher in the other. And so that's kind of how it differs from that general score that is said to be kind of a catch-all for any type of intelligence. Supporters of both Spearman and Thurstone debated for decades about whether G or theories of multiple intelligence were more accurate. So is there one kind of underlying intelligence that, makes you good at pretty much everything, or are there a bunch of different intelligences that can, vary depending on the person? You could be higher in some and lower in the others. And this controversy has actually been largely settled by the eventual adoption of hierarchical models. So basically these models explain that some types of intelligence seem to be nested within others. So we have our lowest level abilities, which would be kind of the specific abilities, the Spearman's S, which are nested within a middle level, such as the Thurstone's primary mental abilities. So those categories that, it wasn't a specific skill, but it kind of encompassed a bunch of related skills. And those are then nested within a general intelligence, so something similar to Spearman's G. So in that way, neither one is really right. Both of them kind of have aspects that could be correct. So there is some kind of general overarching kind of like intelligence factor, but also within it, it can be broken down into kind of multiple different abilities, and within each of those abilities you're going to have specific skills. So it kind of goes from much more general and broad to much more specific. So by the mid-1990s, it was concluded that almost all prior intelligence studies were best explained by that type of 3-level hierarchical model. Recent neurobiological evidence, along with careful analysis of many different data sets, has indicated that there may be 2 different types of G. And you may have heard of fluid and crystallized intelligence before. We'll talk about them in this chapter. We'll also talk about them in the next chapter on development. So basically your fluid intelligence, which could also be known as GF because it's a fluid type of G, is a type of intelligence used in learning new information and solving new problems, not based on knowledge that the person already possesses. So when you are using that kind of G factor intelligence, the fluid intelligence, then that is basically going to help you kind of acquire new knowledge. Whereas crystallized intelligence is a type of intelligence that draws upon prior learning and experience. So things that you've already learned, facts that you already know, and how they can help you kind of accomplish a task or answer a question. So our GF and our GC, our fluid intelligence and our crystallized intelligence, are thought to be mostly separate from each other, with two exceptions. Having greater fluid intelligence may over time lead to greater crystallized intelligence, which kind of makes sense. Obviously, if you are better at learning and processing new information, you're probably going to gain more information and knowledge overall. And it is very difficult and perhaps even impossible to measure GF, or fluid intelligence, without tapping into your pre-existing knowledge and experience. So even though you can try to measure someone's level of fluid intelligence and their kind of aptitude for acquiring new knowledge, you're still going to be tapping into some of the things that they already know and drawing on their prior knowledge and experience. So even though they are mostly separate, there are ways in which they are kind of going to be intertwined regardless. So this is just a figure that kind of illustrates a little bit of that fluid and crystallized intelligence. So the fluid intelligence is dynamic and changing. So you see the lady here is thinking, it seems that Bob is trying to trap my bishop. Hey, that gives me an idea. Maybe I should try to move my pawn. So trying to kind of come up with a new solution to a problem and kind of figure out, you know, how to adapt to a new type of problem. Whereas crystallized thought could be, I've seen this pattern before. An effective counter strategy in other games was to move my bishop. So in that case, Bob, as they kind of call him in this image, is relying on his previous knowledge and experience. So he would be using his crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence. Now we're going to talk about the triarchic theory of intelligence, which is actually my favorite. And for some reason, as far as I can tell, it isn't in the new version of the text. It was in the previous text that we used, and it was in the previous edition of this text. I have a figure on the next page that's from that text, and for some reason it seems to be missing from this text, but we're still going to talk about it because I really like it, and honestly, of all of them, I always say it is kind of the one that appeals to me the most. So in the 1980s, a researcher named Robert Sternberg developed what we call the triarchic theory of intelligence. So tri meaning three. It divides intelligence into three distinct types. We have analytical, practical, and creative intelligence. And this became another very influential model for intelligence. As far as I can tell, nothing has really happened that it would kind of fall from favor. Now I could be missing something, but I did try to kind of look it up when I noticed it wasn't in this most recent text. But you know, it was very influential for a long time, and to my knowledge, it still is today. So essentially, the triarchic theory defines intelligence as the skills and knowledge which you need to succeed in life, according to your own definition of success, within your socio-cultural context. And that's why I think that it appeals to me the most, is because it's not about saying that success means one thing, and you know, succeeding and you know, being your best person has to mean the same thing for everyone. It's basically saying you have what you need to succeed based on how you define success within your specific context, and I personally really like that. So this theory states that anyone can be successful as long as they make the most of their strengths, they correct their weaknesses, and adapt to their environment. Sternberg believed that both practical and creative intelligence are better than analytical intelligence at predicting real-world outcomes. So for example, things like job success. And that's really interesting because analytical intelligence, and we'll talk about these three types briefly, but analytical intelligence would refer to the type of intelligence that we'd see on maybe like a standard IQ test, something like that. Those psychometric ways of measuring intelligence. And Sternberg actually believed that the other two components, you know, might be better at times in terms of predicting success and real-world outcomes. So that was a really kind of interesting and novel claim that he had made. So our analytical intelligence, as I kind of just alluded to, is the book smarts, the ability to reason logically and to be able to find solutions to problems, and it is the kind of ability that will be largely tested on a standardized IQ test. Practical intelligence, on the other hand, is kind of like your street smarts, your ability to find solutions to real-world problems, to adjust to new environments, and to accomplish goals. So it is exactly as it sounds. It's practical. It's something that you use in your day-to-day life. And you've probably all heard of people who are, you know, super book smart, but not very street smart, or vice versa. And then creative, the third type in this theory, is the ability to generate new ideas and novel solutions. And it is required of both artists and scientists, among others. So it's basically, you know, looking at a situation and being able to come up with new and innovative solutions. And, you know, as it sounds, it's basically having that creativity. And so you can see here in this figure that according to Sternberg, the intelligence comprises of these three components, and they are overlapping. You know, they do all kind of overlap at times, but they are also distinct in their own way. So again, you know, this is a personal opinion, and you can have whatever opinion you want on the different types of theories we'll talk about, but in my mind, I really like this theory because it doesn't tell you that you need to be a certain type of intelligent in order to have intelligence or in order to succeed in life. And that's what I find really kind of reassuring about it. So yet another theory of multiple intelligences, this one is talked about quite a bit in the textbook, was proposed by Howard Gardner. So he was inspired by specific cases, such as savants, so like the case of Blind Tom that we talked about at the beginning of this chapter, as well as some individuals who have certain types of brain damage, which indicated that some specific abilities could be dramatically affected while others remained intact. So at times we do see that, you know, somebody might have an extraordinary ability in one way, but, you know, be very, kind of have a lot of deficits in terms of other abilities. Or they might have damage to a certain area of the brain and completely lose one type of intelligence, but, you know, fully maintain some other types. So basically he came up with a theory of multiple intelligences that claimed that there are 7. This was originally, now it's been updated to at least 9 different forms of intelligence, each which is independent from the others. So although it is intuitively appealing to kind of think of intelligence as having all those kind of multiple facets and different components, it has been pointed out that few of these intelligences that he proposed can be accurately and reliably measured, which makes his theory unfalsifiable as well as kind of difficult to research. But from an applied perspective, it can still be useful. So for example, in helping teachers create more diverse and engaging lesson plans, or people see themselves as capable in different ways. It can also help to kind of explain that wide range of human abilities that we see. So although it hasn't really had a large impact in psychology, it has been used in fields such as education and other areas, and it has been proven useful in some ways. So here's a table that kind of goes through some of Gardner's proposed forms of intelligence. So you have the verbal, linguistic, logical, visuospatial, bodily, musical, interpersonal. So you can see that there's a lot more than just that kind of basic analytical type of intelligence that will be measured by a lot of psychometric tests. So some researchers do still argue against theories involving multiple types of intelligences, and they do have some good points at times. So for example, something like interpersonal intelligence, the ability to kind of get along with others and perceive the emotions of others, that's probably more likely due to certain personality traits. So, you know, it may not really be a type of intelligence per se. However, overall, the broadening of the notion of intelligence has been useful in several ways. It does force us to think critically about what we mean when we say intelligence, and to consider how different abilities might help us get through life. It has also led to a focus on teaching children strategies for improving their abilities in different areas, and it's encouraged us to overcome the mental set, which assumes that the only kind of abilities necessary would be the ones that are measured by IQ tests. So, and that's again, if I go back to the triarchic theory, that's exactly why I like that one so much. It doesn't assume that the only thing you need to be successful is to score well on an IQ test. There are different types of intelligence, and you can be successful in your own way based on how you define success in your context. So definitely, regardless of where you kind of fall on that spectrum of kind of one general intelligence or multiple intelligences, the broadening of intelligence has proven useful and helpful in certain ways. Finally, we're going to talk very briefly about what your textbook describes as the battle of the sexes. So a lot of the time you may have heard this question, or you may have seen people try to answer this question of who is smarter, females or males? Is there one sex that's smarter than the other? Very thorough studies have concluded that there are almost no differences in intelligence between the sexes, but overall there seems to be more variability within male scores. So despite the fact that, you know, the averages are very similar, the scores for males are a lot more spread out. The apparent male advantage at the upper levels of ability may be in part due to discrepancies in educational opportunity or unintentional selection bias. So unfortunately, And again, regardless of kind of where you stand on the spectrum of, women's rights and things like that and feminism, there are a lot of ways in which females are disadvantaged in terms of the opportunities they're given for education and work opportunities, making less money, on the dollar when compared to males. And so unfortunately, that may be kind of showing through in some of the results that we see for these types of comparisons. Although males and females do appear to be equally intelligent in general, there are definitely clear differences that emerge when multiple intelligence are considered. So certain types of intelligence show differences between males and females. Women are on average better at verbal abilities, some types of memory tasks, as well as reading emotions, which is probably something that doesn't really come as a surprise, whereas males tend to have an advantage on visuospatial abilities. So I'll show you kind of what we're talking about there. So when we're looking at something like a mental rotation task, like this, where you're trying to find the match for like pattern recognition or spatial awareness, men tend to outperform women on those types of tasks. Whereas if we're talking about verbal fluency, so naming a bunch of words that start with a letter or different kinds of animals, anything that has to do with kind of that verbal ability, women tend to do a little bit better on those types of tasks. So our conclusion would be that neither sex is smarter than the other, but they do have some variations in terms of the types of intelligence, types of tasks that they tend to be better at. And that is the end of Module 2. So a little bit shorter than the first one. The third one should be probably even slightly shorter than this one. And so next time we will be talking about a bunch of different influences that can affect intelligence, like our behavioral influences, our environment, our genetics, things like that. And then that'll be it for our Chapter 9. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you in the next one.